Language doesn't just describe your memories. It decides whether you get to keep them at all. That is the strange, hard-to-swallow claim at the center of one of the most overlooked findings in developmental psychology. Not, language helps you remember better. Language is the actual gatekeeper, standing between an experience and whether it survives into adulthood. Here is the strangest proof of that claim. The age of your very first memory is not fixed by biology alone. It shifts depending on which language and which culture raised you. Two children with identical brains, raised in different linguistic environments, will lose different amounts of their own childhood. Not because their neurons are different, because the words spoken around them were different. To understand why language has this much power, you first have to understand what memory looks like without it. Picture your first 18 months of life. You opened your eyes for the first time. You heard your mother's voice. You tasted food, felt cold air, and eventually took your first step. You remember none of it. Most people assume that's simply because your brain wasn't ready yet. That assumption is only a small part of the real answer. Your infant brain was, in fact, recording an enormous amount of raw information. The real question is why almost none of it survived in a form you can replay today. In 1905, Sigmund Freud was the first person to give this blank space a name. He called it infantile amnesia. He assumed something dramatic was repressing those early memories on purpose. He was wrong about the mechanism, but he was right that something specific was happening. Decades later, researchers proved that infants actually can learn and store information. A famous experiment tied a ribbon from a baby's ankle to a mobile hanging above the crib. The baby learned within minutes that kicking made the mobile move. Days later, brought back to the same crib, the baby remembered instantly. So infant brains are not blank slates incapable of learning. They can absolutely form memories. The real mystery is why those memories almost never make it into adulthood. Part of the answer is structural. Deep in your brain sits a small curved structure called the hippocampus. It works like the engine room that converts a lived moment into a story you can replay later. In infants, the wiring between the hippocampus and the rest of the brain is still under construction. That alone would explain some of the gap, but it is nowhere near the whole explanation. In 2014, researchers in Toronto discovered something stranger. The same explosive growth of new brain cells that builds your hippocampus also overwrites the very connections holding your earliest memories. Your baby brain wasn't too weak to remember. It was too busy constructing itself to also keep flawless records of the process. That explains part of the disappearance. It still does not explain the whole picture. There is a second missing ingredient, one that has nothing to do with brain wiring at all. To store what scientists call an autobiographical memory, you need a sense of self. You need to understand that something is happening to a specific, continuous person, and that person is you. Before roughly 18 months of age, infants don't yet recognize themselves as separate individuals. Researchers proved this with a simple test. They place a small dot of rouge on a baby's nose, then sit the baby in front of a mirror. Before 18 months, the baby reaches toward the mirror, not toward their own face. After 18 months, something changes. The baby reaches for their own nose instead. That shift marks the birth of self-recognition, and it lines up closely with the earliest possible age for autobiographical memory. So now you have two necessary ingredients on the table: a hippocampus wired well enough to store an experience, and a sense of self stable enough to say that experience belonged to you. Here is where most explanations of infantile amnesia simply stop. Structure plus self-awareness. Case closed. But that explanation has a problem nobody likes to talk about. Plenty of 2-, 3-, and 4-year-olds already have a working hippocampus and a clear sense of self, and they still lose almost everything from that period by the time they reach adulthood. something else is required. A third ingredient that turns a passing sensation into a memory sturdy enough to survive for decades. That ingredient is language. Not language as decoration on top of an already formed memory. Language as the actual structural material the memory is built from. Here is the experiment that makes this claim impossible to dismiss. Before a child can speak, an experience exists only as scattered sensory static. Sounds, textures, flashes of light, physical sensations, with absolutely nothing holding them together. Nothing to organize them into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Once a child begins speaking, something changes almost immediately. And once a child begins having conversations with adults about shared events, memory formation accelerates dramatically. A parent asking, "Remember when we went to the park?" is not just making conversation. They are handing the child a structural framework, a container strong enough to hold a memory permanently. Without that structure, an experience behaves exactly like water poured onto dry sand. It exists for an instant, and then it disappears completely, leaving no trace behind. A developmental psychologist named Katherine Nelson spent years studying exactly this mechanism. Her conclusion was blunt, and it reframed the entire field. Language does not describe a memory after the fact. It builds the scaffolding the memory has to live inside in order to survive at all. Without that scaffolding, no amount of hippocampal wiring and no amount of self-awareness is enough on its own. This single claim solves a problem the structural explanation could never fully answer. Why do children with fully functioning brains and clear self-awareness still lose their earliest years? Because a functioning hippocampus and a sense of self only build the container. Language is what actually pours something permanent into it. Consider what happens in the rare cases where language arrives extremely late. Children who are deaf and not exposed to sign language early face a documented delay in forming stable autobiographical memories, even once their hearing brain regions are otherwise typical. Historical cases of children raised in severe linguistic isolation show something even more extreme. Without an early language framework, their capacity to organize personal experience into lasting memory was profoundly and permanently affected. These are not simply stories about hearing or speaking. They are direct evidence for a much bigger claim. Memory formation is not purely a biological event happening inside a skull. It is a linguistic event, built jointly between a developing brain and the words spoken around it. If that sounds like an exaggeration, the cross-cultural evidence removes any doubt. A researcher at Cornell compared the age of earliest childhood memories across cultures around the world. The differences were not small. In cultures where parents constantly narrate a child's daily experiences, asking questions, telling stories, building a shared timeline, earliest memories tend to begin around age 3.5. Among communities with strong oral storytelling traditions, average earliest memories reach back even further, closer to age 2.5. In cultures where early narratives focus less on the individual child specifically, first memories tend to begin closer to age 4, sometimes later. Read those numbers again. A full 1.5 years of separation, driven entirely by how much a culture talks to its children about their own experiences. 2 children, identical biology, identical hippocampal development, identical self-recognition timelines. One remembers being 2.5. The other barely remembers being 4. The only variable that changed was language, and specifically, how much of it was aimed directly at organizing the child's personal experience. This is not a minor detail buried inside a bigger biological story. It is arguably the single most decisive variable in the entire equation. Biology builds the container. Language decides what actually survives inside it. To understand exactly how decisive this is, It helps to walk through what language actually does, mechanically, inside a developing memory. A raw experience arrives as fragments, a smell, a sound, a flash of color, an emotional jolt. None of those fragments have an order. None of them have a beginning or an end. Language does something almost mechanical to that chaos. It assigns a sequence. First this happened, then that happened, then it ended. It assigns a location. This happened at the park, not at home. It assigns an owner. This happened to me, not to someone else. Sequence, location, and ownership are exactly the three things raw sensory experience does not naturally have. Without them, a memory has no shape to hold on to later. With them, suddenly a memory can be filed, retrieved, and replayed on demand, sometimes for the rest of a person's life. This is why a parent's simple habit of narrating a child's day turns out to matter so much more than most people assume. "You fell down, then you cried, then I picked you up," is not just soothing, it is quite literally handing a toddler the exact three ingredients their own brain cannot yet generate on its own. Sequence, location, ownership. Do that enough times, across enough different days, and a child effectively learns the format memories are supposed to come in. Once that format is learned, the child can start applying it independently, even to experiences nobody narrated for them. This is likely why earliest memory age keeps shifting depending on how much narration a culture provides. It's not that certain cultures have better brains, it's that certain cultures hand their children the format earlier and more often. There's a reason this finding took so long to surface. For most of the 20th century, researchers treated memory as a purely biological event, something that happened entirely inside neurons and synapses. Language was treated as an afterthought, a way of describing a memory that had already fully formed. Nelson's research flipped that assumption on its head. Language isn't downstream of memory. It is one of the primary ingredients memory is built from, right alongside neurons and hippocampal wiring. That reframing has consequences well beyond explaining why you can't remember being two. Consider how many other explanations of forgetting quietly assume biology is the whole story. A concussion, a traumatic event, a period of extreme stress, all commonly blamed purely on neurological disruption. But if language is a structural ingredient in memory formation, then the absence of language, or the absence of narrative processing, may play a much larger role in some kinds of memory loss than biology alone. Some trauma researchers have begun exploring exactly this idea. Traumatic memories are frequently described by survivors as fragmented, wordless, and disorganized, closer to raw sensory static than to an ordinary narrative memory. That description sounds remarkably similar to what a memory looks like before language has organized it. This doesn't mean trauma is simply forgotten like a baby forgets. It suggests something more specific. In moments of extreme threat, the brain's capacity to build a language-based narrative may be temporarily disrupted, leaving behind fragments instead of a story. Some forms of therapy now focus explicitly on helping a person put language back around fragmented experience, essentially finishing a memory that never finished forming in the first place. If Nelson is right, that approach isn't just comforting. It is addressing the actual mechanism memory depends on to become stable in the first place. This brings the discussion back to something almost every viewer of this video has personally experienced without realizing it. Think about a vivid childhood memory you're fully confident about. Now ask yourself honestly whether you remember the raw sensory event, or whether you remember a story about the event that you or your family has repeated many times. For most adults, it's almost impossible to tell the difference. That's not a flaw in your memory. That is exactly what language-built memory is supposed to feel like from the inside. Memory researchers have a specific term for memories heavily shaped by repeated retelling. They call them narrative reconstructed memories, built as much from language as from the original sensory experience. This can feel unsettling once you notice it. It also explains something almost every parent eventually discovers. You can tell your child the story of their first birthday in loving detail every single year, and your child, now grown, will still have no memory of the original event itself. What they have instead is your story about the event, absorbed so thoroughly it feels like their own memory. That is not a failure of memory. That is language doing exactly the job it evolved to do, just working on second-hand material instead of first-hand experience. None of this makes early narration less valuable. If anything, it makes it more valuable, because it is quite literally constructing the container a person's identity will eventually be built around. A richly narrated childhood produces an adult with a longer, more detailed personal timeline to draw from, regardless of how many of those memories are technically first-hand or reconstructed. A sparsely narrated childhood produces the opposite, an adult with a shorter timeline and fewer language-built anchors to hold on to. Neither outcome reflects anything about a child's intelligence or worth. It simply reflects how much linguistic scaffolding surrounded their early years. So here, laid out fully, is what actually determines whether an experience survives into adulthood as a memory. First, a hippocampus wired well enough to encode the experience at all. Second, a stable sense of self to say the experience belonged specifically to you. Third, and most decisively, language sturdy enough to give that experience a sequence, a location, and an owner. Remove any one of the three, and the memory collapses. Remove the third one specifically, and the collapse is nearly total, regardless of how well the first two are functioning. This is why the age of your first memory says less about your biology than most people assume. It says more about how much language was wrapped around your earliest years, and by whom. Every human being who has ever lived went through some version of this exact process. Every person you've ever met has an identical blank space where their first years should be. The size of that blank space, however, is not fixed. It shrinks or grows, depending on how much narrative structure a child received early on. That is a strange kind of power to hand to something as simple as talking to a toddler. A parent who narrates constantly is not simply bonding. They are actively building the scaffolding their child's entire personal history will eventually hang from. A culture that emphasizes oral storytelling is not simply preserving tradition. It is functionally extending its children's accessible memory further back than cultures that don't. Freud named the blank space in 1905 without ever understanding what filled it or what was missing from it. Decades of neuroscience explained part of the mechanism. Nelson's research on language explained the piece that made all of it click into place. Comfort, biology, and self-awareness set the stage. Language is what actually walks onto it and starts building something permanent. Consider, one more time, the two children from opposite sides of the planet. Same biology, same neurons, same developmental timeline for self-recognition. Different words spoken around them, at different rates, in different shapes. One remembers back to 2.5, the other barely remembers 4. Neither child did anything wrong. Neither brain is more or less developed than the other. The only variable that moved was language, and it moved the boundary of each child's entire accessible past. That is not a footnote in the story of memory. That is arguably the whole story, once biology has done its necessary but insufficient part. So the next time somebody says they simply don't remember much from being a kid, there's a very specific, testable reason behind it. It's not that their brain failed them, it's that somewhere in those early years, the words needed to build a lasting memory simply weren't spoken often enough or early enough to finish the job. Biology opens the door. Language decides how much of what happened on the other side of it gets to stay. This is why two people can live through the exact same event and remember it completely differently years later. It's not always about attention, or emotion, or importance. Sometimes it's simply about which version got put into words first, and how many times. Whoever tells the story first, in some very real sense, decides what gets remembered. That includes the story other people tell about your own childhood, long before you were able to tell it yourself. Which means part of your memory was never entirely yours to begin with. It was handed to you, one sentence at a time, before you even knew you needed it.